Snow fell like memory, slow, soundless, deliberate. It softened the world into white and blurred the edges of grief. Beneath the skeletal birches on the ridge, the townsfolk gathered, their boots crunching frost as Reverend Vale's voice trembled over the open grave. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, but the wind stole half his words, and what lingered was only the low, desperate whine of the dog beside the coffin. Ash had not stopped trembling since dawn. His fur, dusted with snow, caught the pale winter light like frost on iron. When they lowered Marshal Eli Crow's body into the ground, the dog barked once, harsh, broken, and threw himself toward the casket. Two men tried to hold him back, but his strength was wild, almost human in its anguish. People whispered that the beast had gone mad, that animals sometimes sensed what men refused to name. The sheriff turned his collar against the wind, eyes fixed anywhere but on the grave. Mara Lark stood apart, her gloved hands clasped, her breath rising in slow, visible ghosts. She had spent 5 years riding beside Eli, learning the measured silence he wore like armor. He had been the sort of man whose kindness was a flicker, not a flame, too brief to warm you but bright enough to remember. The day before he died, he'd said little beyond a tired, "Take care of him," nodding toward Ash. She hadn't known it was a farewell. Now the air carried the scent of soil and gun oil and winter pine. Someone muttered that Eli's death had been no hero's fall, that he'd gone rogue, chasing ghosts in the hills, and gotten himself killed by his own kind. Gossip moved through the crowd like smoke, thin and choking. Mara didn't turn to face them. She simply lowered her head and watched as Ash pressed his paw against the coffin lid, whimpering as though begging to follow. Sheriff Burke shifted beside her. "Get that animal out of here," he said, voice rough from cold or guilt. His gray mustache twitched with irritation. "We've given the man his honors. Let's not turn this into a circus." Reverend Vale murmured something about loyalty, but Burke's glare cut him short. Mara met the sheriff's gaze then. Beneath his hat brim, his eyes were tired, bloodshot, and evasive. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw fear flicker there, but it vanished as quickly as it came. When the last prayer faded, the townsfolk dispersed, leaving only the sound of wind curling through the trees and Ash's restless pacing. Mara lingered. The snow had deepened to a fine, powdery hush, settling on Eli's cross. The dog finally lay down beside the grave, his head on the fresh mound, refusing to move. "Come on, boy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "It's over." Ash raised his head, eyes glinting amber in the dim light. He looked at her, not through her, not beyond her, but into her, with an awareness that made her chest ache. When she reached out, he didn't flinch, only pressed his muzzle into her palm. The warmth of him felt undeserved. That night, the town's lanterns flickered weakly behind frosted glass. The tavern laughter echoed hollowly against the snow. Mara walked the empty road toward the edge of town, coat pulled tight, boots sinking into the whiteness. She could hear Ash behind her, his paws muffled but steady. She didn't send him away. Eli's cabin stood abandoned at the forest's edge, its windows dark, the porch half buried. She had cleaned it out after the funeral arrangements, stacked his few belongings neatly, as if order could soften absence. Inside, the air still carried a faint trace of him, leather, tobacco, and pine soap. The dog padded through the doorway, nose twitching, tail low. He moved from room to room, sniffing corners, pausing before the empty chair by the fire. Mara lit a match and watched it flare, her fingers shaking. "He's not coming back," she said softly, though whether to herself or to Ash, she couldn't tell. The dog circled once, then settled at her feet. Outside, the wind rose. It rattled the eaves and whistled through the cracks like a voice trying to be heard. She thought of Eli's last night, how quiet he'd been, how he'd stared too long at the evidence satchel on his desk before slipping it into the drawer. He'd told her he'd found something that would set things right. She hadn't asked what. "You didn't pry into another's ghosts in a town like this." A thump against the door made her start. When she opened it, the storm had thickened and snow spiraled like white smoke. Nothing stood there but cold and night. Yet Ash growled, low and guttural, staring out toward the line of pines. His hackles rose. "What is it?" she murmured. But the forest was still, only the distant creak of branches, heavy with ice. After a moment, the dog relaxed, though his eyes stayed fixed on something unseen. She closed the door and fed a few logs to the fire. Sparks leapt up, throwing golden light on the walls. Her shadow swayed behind her, long and uncertain. She sat on the floor, one hand resting on Ash's fur. The rhythm of his breathing steadied her own. In the following days, whispers spread thicker than the snowfall. Some claimed Eli had been investigating the sheriff himself. Others said he'd stolen county evidence and died running from his own badge. Mara ignored them, though each rumor cut like glass. The truth, she sensed, was heavier, something buried deeper than talk could reach. Every evening she returned to the grave. She brought fresh candles, pressed them into the snow, and watched their small flames tremble against the wind. And every evening Ash was there before her, pacing, digging, barking at shadows. His devotion had turned feverish, desperate, as though he were trying to unearth not only his master, but what had been hidden with him. On the fifth night, the moon hung thin and sharp over the valley. The air stung with cold so deep it seemed to hum. Mara knelt beside the grave, brushing snow away from the wooden cross. The letters, E.C., were already half faded. Ash began to paw at the ground, frantic. She tried to stop him, but he growled softly a warning. The sound wasn't anger, it was insistence. She let him dig. Snow and dirt scattered in uneven clumps until his claws struck something hard. Mara reached down. Her gloves brushed against waxed cloth, something wrapped carefully, sealed against damp. She pulled it free, heart pounding, and unrolled it beneath the moonlight. It was a small scrap of parchment, its ink smudged but legible enough to read a few haunting words. If I don't make it back, tell her the truth lies beneath the badge. The handwriting was Eli's. Her breath caught. The wind whistled through the trees again, and for a moment she could swear she heard his voice in it, a faint whisper of apology or warning. She looked down at Ash, whose gaze met hers steadily, unflinching. In those eyes was something that felt almost like guidance. She pressed the note to her chest. Around her the forest exhaled and the candles flickered out one by one. The grave lay open in silence, snow gathering softly over the disturbed earth. Ash whined, lowered his head, and rested his paw over the hole, as if to say not yet. Mara rose slowly, the wind tangling her hair, the note trembling in her hand. The town lights flickered below, distant and indifferent. Behind her, Ash began to howl, a long echoing sound that climbed the hills and seemed to stir the very air. It was not grief this time. It was remembrance. She turned toward the forest. Something in her had shifted, subtle but sure. The stillness before resolve. The snow continued to fall, erasing tracks, blurring edges. But she felt certain of one thing now. Eli Crow had not died by accident. When she looked back, the grave was almost covered again, smoothed by the storm. Only the cross remained visible, tilting slightly under the weight of snow. Ash sat beside it, head bowed. For a long moment she watched him, the two of them alone in that white, endless quiet. Then she whispered, "We'll find out what you're trying to tell me, boy." "I promise." Ash lifted his head. His ears twitched, and in the reflection of his eyes the moon burned cold and unwavering. The night held its breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge a door slammed, a light flickered out, and the world returned to stillness. When Mara finally turned to leave, the snow was deep enough to hide her footprints before she took her third step. Ash followed close behind, silent, his shadow merging with hers until both dissolved into the drifting veil of white. By the time the wind died, only the grave remained. Blanketed again in calm, a secret waiting beneath the snow, patient as time itself. Morning crept slowly over the town, pale and uncertain. The snow had hardened overnight, and the streets gleamed under a brittle glaze of ice. Mara walked through the quiet, the parchment hidden beneath her coat, the words echoing in her mind. The truth lies beneath the badge. She couldn't stop hearing Eli's voice as he'd said it, not in the letter, but in life, low, steady, with that faint sadness that always lingered at the edge of his speech. Ash trotted beside her, silent now, his movements deliberate. It was as if he understood that the search had begun. At the sheriff's office, the lamps were still burning. Burke was inside, leaning over a map, his broad frame casting a heavy shadow across the wall. Mara paused at the window before entering. The warmth of the glass against her palm startled her. It felt like trespass. She took a breath and stepped in. He looked up slowly. "You're early, Deputy," he said, voice smooth, almost kindly. "The roads are ice. You shouldn't be out." She placed her gloves on the table. "You knew Eli better than most," she began. Tell me, why was he out near Red Hollow the night he died? Burke's hand stilled over the map. You know that answer, he replied. He was following a lead. I found something near his grave, she said. A note in his handwriting. He mentioned you. That caught him off guard, though only for an instant. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed, the calm surface cracking. You're treading dangerous ground, Mara. She held his gaze. He trusted me to look after the dog. Maybe he meant more than that. Silence filled the room, thick and waiting. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Ash sat by the door, head lowered but alert. Burke sighed and sank into his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Eli was a good man, he said. Too good for the work we do. Sometimes good men die because they can't see what's necessary. What was necessary? Burke didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the cabinet behind him, the one Eli had kept locked. For the briefest moment, her heart stumbled. That same cabinet had been sealed after his death, its key said to be missing. She took a step closer. Did you ever find the file he was carrying that night? He looked up sharply. What file? The tone was wrong, too sharp, too rehearsed. She saw it then, the faint sheen of sweat at his temple, the twitch of his jaw. The story was cracking open, and the smell of something rotten rose from beneath. When she left the office, her legs trembled. The cold bit through her coat, yet she barely felt it. She followed the road north, past the sawmill, toward the forest edge. Ash stayed close, his breath clouding the air. The day was clear, brittle, the sky a washed-out blue. Beneath the frost, the land held secrets like a body holds scars. Eli had always ridden this path when he wanted quiet. She remembered his words, "You can hear truth better in silence than in talk." Following that instinct, she listened. The forest hummed faintly, wind threading through pine needles, the creak of branches heavy with ice. Then, beneath it, a sound she hadn't expected, metal groaning under weight. She followed it through the trees until the ground sloped toward an old mine entrance, half buried under snow and rock. A chain hung across the opening, its links rusted but recently disturbed. Footprints led inside, large ones, booted, and too fresh for comfort. Her pulse quickened. She drew her lantern, struck a match, and stepped into the dark. The air inside was damp and cold, filled with the scent of earth and old coal. The tunnel curved downward, walls slick with frost. Ash stayed close, every movement tense. She caught the glint of something metallic ahead. A row of crates, stamped with government insignias, half scraped off. One lay open, revealing rifles wrapped in burlap. Contraband. Eli's handwriting was on one of the tags, his initials marked at the corner. He had found this place. He'd been here before he died. A faint sound echoed behind her. Bootsteps. She doused the lantern at once. Darkness swallowed her. Her hand tightened on her revolver. Ash's ears pricked. Mara. The voice came low, deliberate. You should have stayed out of this. Burke stepped into the thin beam of light from the mine mouth, pistol drawn. The gray of his coat blended with the walls, his breath steady. You were always too curious for your own good. She kept her voice even. So it's true. Eli died because he found this. He died because he couldn't look the other way, Burke said. You think I wanted that? He left me no choice. She felt the ache of betrayal settle into her bones. You swore an oath. So did he, the sheriff snapped. And what did it get him? A hole in the ground and a town that can't afford to lose faith in its badge. Ash growled softly. The sound seemed to fill the narrow space, vibrating against the rock. Burke's gun wavered just slightly. I won't tell the town, she said, voice low, but I'll make sure they know who Eli really was. He shook his head. No one will believe you. She raised her lantern again. They'll believe the dog. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Burke stepped forward, raising his weapon. The shot came almost with the same breath, but Ash was faster. He leapt, a blur of motion and instinct, his body colliding with Burke's arm. The gun fired upward, the bullet ricocheting off stone. The echo thundered through the mine. Mara lunged, striking the lantern to the ground. Flames flared, illuminating the scene in wild, flickering gold. Burke stumbled backward, trying to aim again, but Ash's jaws locked around his wrist. He cried out, the gun clattering across the floor. She grabbed it first. Enough, she said, her voice shaking, the sound of authority and grief bound together. Burke froze. The firelight caught his face, exhausted, desperate, aged beyond its years. He was my friend, he whispered. You think I wanted this life? Mara didn't answer. There were no words big enough to hold what she felt. The flame spread along the crates now, catching the burlap. The air thickened with smoke. She backed toward the tunnel mouth, calling for Ash. The dog released Burke and turned, barking once as if to command her to move. They emerged into daylight just as the fire roared behind them. The mine collapsed inward with a shuddering groan, snow and ash rising like ghosts. The sound carried down into the valley, a long sigh, like something ancient finally letting go. When the silence returned, she stood on the ridge, chest heaving, the sheriff's gun still clutched in her hand. Behind her, the tunnel was gone. Before her, the world stretched endless and white. By evening, word had spread. They said the old mine had burned itself out from within, that the sheriff had gone missing in the storm. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers. The town had its peace again, brittle as ice but unbroken. Mara sat beside Eli's grave as dusk settled. The snow was falling again, soft and slow, the air faintly tinged with smoke from the distant fire. Ash lay beside her, his head on his paws, calm at last. She placed the burnt parchment on the grave and pressed it into the snow. "You were right," she whispered. "The truth was under the badge. And now it's where it belongs, with you." The candles flickered, small circles of light against the dim. The wind moved gently, carrying the faint scent of pine and ash. She thought of Eli's quiet smile, the way he'd looked at the horizon as though it held an answer he could almost touch. Perhaps he'd known this ending long before she did. Ash raised his head then, ears twitching. He looked toward the hilltop where the last light of sunset bled through the clouds. For an instant the color touched his fur, turning it to bronze. He let out a low sound, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh, and pressed his nose to the wooden cross. Mara reached out, her hand resting on his back. "You kept your promise," she said. "And so did I." They stayed that way for a long time until the dark settled fully and the candles burned out. When she finally rose, she felt lighter, though she couldn't say why. The town below had quieted. Somewhere, a church bell tolled, a reminder that life, for all its cruelty, still carried rhythm. She turned to go, and Ash followed, his steps unhurried, tail brushing against her coat. As they walked, their shadows stretched across the snow, blending into one shape. At the crest of the hill, she paused and looked back once more. The grave was almost hidden under the new snow, peaceful and still. For the first time, she didn't feel the ache of loss, only gratitude that love, however fleeting, had once been real. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the cold air. "Rest easy, Marshal. We'll keep the light." The wind stirred softly in reply, and for a heartbeat she thought she heard a familiar whistle in it, the one Eli used to call his dog. Ash's ears lifted and his tail wagged once. Then he turned forward again, leading her home through the falling snow. In the distance, the church bell faded, leaving only the hush of winter and the steady rhythm of their footsteps. The story was over, but the silence it left behind was the kind that lingered, a silence made of truth, of loyalty, and of love that had learned to endure beyond loss.